Hello everybody, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Presenting today are Rob McGovern and Chris Dutch from LogRhythm, and they will be addressing how organisations, including us at LogRhythm, are handling compliance with GDPR and how a SIEM solution can streamline your compliance with the regulation. We'll be going over the GDPR basics and looking at GDPR in the real world, and then we'll be delving into how to leverage SIEM for GDPR compliance, looking specifically at LogRhythm as well. So before we get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the questions feature of the BrightTalk interface, and at the end of the presentation we'll get to as many questions as we can. Before we get started, I would like to have the audience participate in a voting question, and the first question we have is, how far along are you in your GDPR compliance journey? So I'm going to start the vote, and there are 5 options to choose from. And while you're voting, I would like to hand over to Rob to take us into the first part of the presentation. So over to you, Rob.
All right, thank you. I'm Rob McGovern. I'm a Senior Technical Product Manager here at LogRhythm, and one of my focus areas is compliance. So if you hear an American-sounding voice, that's going to be me. I'm co-presenting with Chris Dutch from our UK office, so when you hear the proper British-sounding voice, that's going to be Chris. He's more of a GDPR expert. He's been reviewing regulations and dealing with compliance around it for, the last couple of years, I think. So we're going to get in real quickly to some GDPR basics. Most of this is hopefully old hat to you, but I want to make sure that we're all talking the same language and using the same words. So when we talk about GDPR, there's really 3 major names or roles you need to know. The first is the data subject. This is an EU citizen, somebody who has personally identifiable information. It could be anyone. It could be an employee. It could be a customer. It could be somebody you're trying to market to. It could be somebody you're trying to recruit to hire into your company. It could be a member of the general public who you happen to capture information about. Your company is what's known as the data controller. They're the ones that are collecting that information. They're the ones that define the purpose of the data. They hold the keys to that personally identifiable information. And as a data controller, you might then hand off the data to something known as a data processor. So a classic example of this is if you have a retail store and you have credit card machines, you might have subcontracted out that payment part of the system to a third-party vendor, particularly for PCI compliance reasons and among others. That data processor that's taking that credit card and that personally identifiable information and executing the transaction for you does not own or control the data. That's up to the data controller. But both the data controller and the data processor are responsible for that data and have to make sure that it meets the GDPR regulations. So as we're talking about GDPR, you're going to talk about data subject, that's the person who has data. Data controller, that's the group that's trying to do something with the data, collecting it, has reasons to have it. And then the data processor, who again is that subcontractor essentially of working with the data but is not the primary owner. Any data that you collect has to have a legitimate legal processing reason, and there's 6 official reasons. The ones I really want to call out here, compliance with the legal obligation is in some ways perhaps the easiest, and you'll see this with things like banking industries that have very strong know your customer rules. You're not allowed to open an account unless you've provided several different forms of ID, and that's a legal compliance obligation. The bank has to collect that data. They have a legitimate legal reason for it. Performance of a contract is another real common, simple one. You as a data subject have entered into an agreement with the data controller. Where this gets interesting, though, is it can show up anywhere. It can be signing up for a warranty on a device. That becomes a performance of a contract. There's an implicit contract between you and the company that had that warranty. They have a right to have your information under that performance of a contract. They have to be able to contact you if something goes wrong with that device. Legitimate interest, public interest, and vital interest get a little blurry and fuzzy. These are kind of catch-all reasons for emergency services being able to take down information from you when you call and say, I've just had an accident, come help me. That falls into both public and vital interest potentially. So those get a little fuzzy. The one that everybody is really getting stuck on is consent, which is kind of the last reason. The data subject has given consent for the data controller and the data processor to have that data and use it. This is why every single website that you go to these days has changed their warnings about cookies and allowing you to manage your data. You are giving consent for your data to be collected by that data controller and processed by whatever data processors they choose. So when we talk about the roles, we're talking about those data subject, data controller, data processor, and ultimately we're always talking about those 6 compliance reasons.
Yep.
Chris, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, Rob, just before we move on, so there are a couple of other points that I just wanted to make. Obviously, the audience has to remember that the definition of personally identifiable information or personally identifiable data has changed. The EU has basically changed it to include almost everything directly attributable to an individual, but also inferable to an individual. So we just have to be a bit more careful with that. The other thing is that in most cases, with most organizations that are handling data, the controller and the processor will probably be the same. But note that in security terms, using a managed service will probably separate these and things get a little bit more fuzzy. So if we get the chance to go over that later, I will make sure to add that.
I think you've hit on a couple of key points. The definition of PII is perhaps one of the biggest changes in GDPR because it includes things like IP addresses. You can potentially infer that back to the user. Geolocation, potentially infer that all the way back to the individual. It's a much, much broader definition. And the second thing you said, I think, is really worth phrasing here. You can't talk about GDPR. You can't peel back the onion and hit the next layer without saying it gets a bit fuzzy. There's an awful lot of GDPR that gets into the very fuzzy realm of exactly what are the specific differentiation between legitimate interest, public interest, vital interest, what exactly is PII. We're going to see all that play out, I think, over the next couple of years as various court cases unfold. So this slide I had it as know that your rights with the your crossed out, but unfortunately that didn't quite make it into the final presentation here. When we talk about that data subject, they have 4 rights in regard to their data. The first is right to access. The data subject must have the ability to see what information you have collected about them or find that information somehow. And this is again why, again, probably the easiest example is those new cookie warning screens always have a little settings button in the corner so that you can go see exactly what they're trying to collect and use. The right to rectify means that the data subject can change inaccurate personal data, which means that they have to be able to see the data, they have to have a mechanism to tell you what's wrong, and then you have to have a response to fixing it. Right to erasure is probably one of the tougher ones because this is something you haven't seen in any other kind of compliance, which is that the data subject may request removal from your system. And that is potentially scary because, again, that covers every possible aspect of PII. It's being a customer being removed from your database. That's probably pretty straightforward. But what about the person who applied to work for your company where you have their resume on file? Yeah, that's a legitimate PII case that's covered under GDPR. That person who applied to your company, even if you didn't hire them, has the right to ask you to erase that. And that's going to affect your internal policies. And then the last one is the right to object. The data subject must be able to deny consent. This is kind of the opt-in, opt-out clauses of choosing not to be part of whatever processing, profiling, or decision-making is going on. And this one is you have to understand how your data is being handled by those data processors, whether it's yourself or a third-party company, and have a mechanism to exclude users or data subjects from that. So these are, again, pretty sticky because they're very broad. They sound really good from a human perspective, but they're actually very, very hard to control from a technology perspective. So data controller and data processor both must support these rights, which means that not only do they have to internally have systems that do these things, but they have to have ways for the communication to happen where the data controller can pass information to the data processor that says, change this data and remove this data subject. And that's going to, again, open up a whole new world of technology as well as the areas you have to monitor. Enforcement, this is the stuff everybody's heard about. Again, some new names. The Data Protection Authority is the big one. Each EU member nation has a national monitoring and enforcement authority. This is also one of the biggest legal challenges right now in GDPR. In the UK, the Data Protection Authority is the Information Commissioner's Office. And Chris, I know you've had some thoughts about what happens with Brexit.
Yeah, so there have still been whispers that it might have to move to Dublin, at least because when you're talking about GDPR compliance in external countries like the US and the South American area, Asia, they all have to report to a European DPA, and they will likely be reporting to an English language one. it was assumed that the UK Information Commissioner's Office would be the DPA, the de facto DPA for Europe, but actually it seems it may have to move to Dublin because we will no longer be part of the EU.
And for United States-based companies, it's somewhat of a similar issue. We don't have a national level DPA, so can you attach yourself to one of the EU ones? And what's the legal chain there? Because the step below DPA is what's known as a supervisory authority, or sometimes a lead supervisory authority. And this is sort of the independent public authority that monitors the regulations on behalf of the DPA. So when your DPA is not a, take the United States, for example, if our DPA ends up being in Dublin, what would the lead supervisory authority be, and what would the legal trail of responsibility be? So we've already seen a couple of court cases in the U.S. trying to establish the legality of the connection between the DPA, the supervisory authority, and the GDPR compliance in terms of enforcement. And then the third role, the Data Protection Office, is the one that every company needs to have. You must have a designated DPO. Quite often this is a role that in smaller companies you're going to see dropped on top of whoever is also picking up the Chief Information Security Officer role or a Chief Compliance role. But this is the individual or group of individuals appointed to ensure adherence to the GDPR. So the Data Protection Office has very specific roles and responsibilities in GDPR. Lead Supervisory Authority is the local level monitoring authority that the DPA has to work with, or the DPO has to work with, and then the DPA is the national level authority that ultimately determines things like the fines for compliance and gathers and aggregates the reporting. Did I get all that right, Chris?
Sounds all good to me.
All right. So responsibilities of a Data Protection Office, first and foremost, is essentially audit. You must know what personally identifiable data is in your control. What are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? What reason do you have for collecting it? How are you going to enforce the rights around it? How are you going to monitor it? How are you going to respond when or if breaches happen? And that starts with something called a DPIA, or Data Protection Impact Assessment. So it's a risk-based assessment methodology. It's a good compliance framework to go identify where your data is, identify what risks are known around your data, and how you're going to mitigate those risks, as well as complying with the GDPR rules. And that's where the second document, that's changed names a few times over the course of GDPR, but I believe that the current name is still Privacy Impact Assessment, or PIA, which is, again, how are you going to manage the rights of that data. From there, you go into the binding corporate rules, which is the umbrella for essentially what controls you're putting in place around the risks identified in the DPIA and the PIA. So binding corporate rules are what we would see in almost any other compliance, is essentially the set of controls you have to follow and show that you have in place and that you're monitoring. And then in addition to those controls, you have to have a breach notification mechanism. The GDPR law says that you must communicate to your supervisory authority within 72 hours after you've identified that a data breach has occurred. And that's a scary time frame, because 72 hours is barely over a weekend, so that means you have to have your plans in place. You basically have to have them tested, and you have to have really good controls around that to be able to meet that requirement. So this is another one that I think is kind of scary with GDPR, and one that's getting a lot of attention, a lot of focus.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sorry, Rob.
No, go ahead, Chris.
The compliance piece is actually mostly just the first 50 or so articles of GDPR. I mean, the rest of it is mostly legalese. But the cybersecurity piece is also rolled into that, but needs to be shared among departments. That's something like Articles 32 through 44. And we'll probably come back to that later on in the presentation.
Yeah. So then the penalties, the scary thing is, up to 20 million euros, or 4% of global annual revenue. That's the newspaper tagline, the one that you've seen everywhere to scare everybody about GDPR. But it's a pretty hefty fine. It's broken into two tiers, and fines are not automatic. The supervisory authority, whether it's the DPA or the supervisory authority, can issue warnings. They can issue reprimands that are more public. They can order compliance and give you a window to achieve compliance. They can preemptively communicate data breach to data subjects without your consent, awareness, or modification of what their communication looks like. these are all options in addition to or above the fines that could be levied. Again, we haven't seen these fines hit yet, and it's a little bit unclear with GDPR. There's other compliance where it has to be made public, and the fines are pretty well fixed. GDPR is feeling a lot more like Sarbanes-Oxley, or to a certain degree even like the PCI compliance, where the fines are public as out there being scary, but when a company actually gets hit with them, we're not sure what that dollar number is really going to be, and it's probably going to be something that ends up negotiated through courts. I think the key point, though, is big fines, and this is why everybody's worried about GDPR and talking about GDPR.
Obviously, a lot of those fines will be set at different levels depending on severity, and we will require legal precedence for that.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be real fascinating over the second half of the year to see who gets hit with the first fine, because we know it's coming.
Absolutely. So on to the next slide. So I wanted to go over some of the stages of preparation here. Now, most companies that are already engaged in GDPR compliance should have already covered most of these points by this time. Just wanted to make sure that it was clear. So obviously the first thing that you really need to do is have those network and storage audits. They're important because that's knowing where your data is kept and knowing where the personal data is kept. Where necessary, there should be DPO appointments. Sometimes that is a role that is given to a CISO or CTO, and they will split their role into those two. But then, obviously, as we've explained before, there's the DPIAs and the PIAs. Now, they're a necessary step in audit procedure to assess vulnerability to data and also the risk to your organization. Now, the next is internal policy shift. Now, this isn't actually specifically stipulated within the GDPR, but get your house in order, right? Like any other good security measure, it all starts with awareness. And once you've started on the path, you need to make sure that the rest of the company is following you. So you've got data breach response planning, and that's just how to find a threat, how to report a breach, what information do you report when you find a breach, and how do you combat that breach, or how do you combat threats in general to the personal data. Marketing policy changes, I'm not going to go deeply into this, but there are a lot of different things to look at with B2B and B2C companies. It changes depending on the type of company and type of marketing you're doing as well. You've got protection of personal data. This is pretty obvious, really. Applying actual protections, physical protections, to data that has been identified in those audits. And that covers, say, 10% of the actual compliance regulations. Those are the bits to get you up to that level where you can say to the EU that you're more or less ready. The rest of it is actually just continuous monitoring and audits. Those are the most important bits, and I just wanted to stress the fact that that is 90% of the actual compliance, is the continued part. So if I just move on to the next slide here, we have some issues with GDPR. I am sure that people have been aware of this for a little while. Now, the main ones are the ones that have precipitated the need for legal precedence, but the common ones are pointed out that online, and they've been challenged by both DPAs and organizations to answer these. So the first one is, security of processing in Article 32. Now, they have provisions for the pseudonymization or encryption of personal data. There's no description of what encryption you need, level of encryption, or types of pseudonymization. I knew I was never going to get that one right.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the the trickier parts of GDPR, is just the one word.
Absolutely. Also, I spelled it with an S in here. The second problem would be with data protection by design and by default. Now, there's no specificity on approach to compliance, tooling, or guidelines to the level of data protection that you actually need. That's something that I'll just approach in a minute. The next part is probably certification. Now, the GDPR encourages the creation of standards to match the GDPR, but it does not provision for existing standards, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then reporting a breach. you've got very, very, very specific amounts of information on details that have to be reported. So cause, effect, measures to be taken, direct communication with both the ICO and the people who are affected, so the data subjects. And then it clearly states that the data controller is responsible, which means that if you are outsourcing your data or your security, for that matter, then they are the ones who are going to be responsible for that data. So, just answering some of these. With regards to the encryption part, just use accepted standards from other recent compliance mandates. That's things like PCI DSS 3.2. They provision for the latest TLS encryption standards. Next up, now the ICO among all the DPAs has some very strict provisions on this. It recommends that organizations ensure that personal data is automatically protected in any IT system, service, product, and or business practice. So basically, we don't have to take any action as individuals to protect our own data. With certification, the consensus, now this isn't strictly GDPR, the consensus among most companies is that continuing to following existing compliance mandates is strong evidence to the EU of certification. Local DPAs may also begin offering other GDPR certifications, but there's no rumors about that actually happening yet. So we'll see what everyone decides later on. The last part is reporting a breach. We need to find tooling to monitor, audit, and mitigate breaches, preferably with SAO, that's security automation and orchestration for collation of evidence and also mitigation of threats automatically. But tools must also have the ability to identify the subjects who are affected so that the data controller can inform the subjects who have been affected by a breach. Anyway, I should probably hand it over to Laura now for the results of...
Actually, before we let Laura reveal the results, I think there's a couple of key points here that are really worth emphasizing. The certification is another great one to call out. GDPR is not a checkbox compliance like PCI or NIST or some of the others where you can literally just walk down the list and say, have I done this? Yes. Have I done this? Yes. And that's where it gets, gets a little bit fuzzy with GDPRs. If you are PCI compliant, you maybe are HIPAA compliant, you're maybe compliant with, ISO 27001. Those are become or can become potentially those binding corporate rules that say that you're paying attention to the data. And you can certainly leverage all the work that you've done for that compliance to help you out. But there is no simple checklist that says I am GDPR compliant because all my doors are locked, all my communications are TLS 1.2. It's not that kind of a regulation. I think the other one that ties into this very much is that data protection by design and default. This is, again, a great architectural exercise. But in the real world, you're dealing with systems that you spend a lot of money, you spend a lot of time, they're core to your business, they've existed for 5, 10, 20, 40 years. They weren't built with data protection and data privacy by design. Trying to retrofit that is a massive, massive undertaking. So these are cases where if you're building something new, you should be thinking about data protection by design. If you're looking at something old, you may have to look at compensating controls. How can you wrap that system in a layer of security that lets you know when that data is moving, when it's accessed, who's accessing it? Because you can't necessarily go in there and say, hey, I'm going to take the old mainframe databases and make sure that everything's encrypted. Probably not going to happen anytime in the next 20 years until you completely replace those systems.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris and Rob. So indeed, we are going to look at the audience vote that you've been doing, the question number 1, which is how far along you are on your GDPR compliance journey. So the vote has stopped, and the results are, Rob, I'd like you to pass comment on this, please. Now, 60% of the audience are saying that they know they have to do it, 20% have a DPO assigned, and 10% on having a published DPIA and PIA documents, and BCRs are in place and regularly audited. So what do you think about that vote?
I think it's not very surprising to me. I mean, we just went to the Information Security Conference in the UK, and just walking around and talking to people there, I think that it kind of hits one of the next slides we're going to talk about. there's a relationship between compliance, IT, and security, and GDPR kind of came from the side into that. So we saw a lot of the security professionals at InfoSec, they were kind of aware of GDPR, but it hadn't really kind of completely trickled through their legal evaluation yet to get them involved with securing the data. So now that GDPR is completely live, and it's almost, essentially should be too late, but isn't, the security teams are finally getting involved to start looking at the true audit and the true security controls and compensating controls.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit sad by it, but it's actually not very surprising to me at all from everything that we've seen and heard. And Chris, if you have any thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. This is kind of what I expected. I'm a little bit shocked by the 60%, knowing we have to do it, but not quite necessarily tackling GDPR at this level yet. But yeah, to be fair, I knew that was going to be on top.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Before we get into the next segment of the presentation, just another audience vote, please. So I'm going to start the voting on this one, and this is about how involved you are in your GDPR compliance plans for your company. So again, there are 5 options here, and while you guys are voting, I would like to hand over to Chris.
Thank you very much, Laura. So I'm going to quickly go over some practical real-world GDPR examples, and we are going to first look at some examples from the field. Now, there aren't that many. It only happened in May, but one of the first things that you will probably notice is the Dixon Carphone breach. Now, this happened last year, so it's not really covered by GDPR, and we know from a lot of news stories that are already on that the fines would have been a lot more massive had it been a GDPR covered breach. So things to look at here are whether or not they did the right thing with regards to GDPR. Now, there's a lot of things that GDPR would not allow for. When was this reported? Now, I believe it was reported sometime in July last year. We still don't know what actions they took and how they shared it with the ICO. We just know that the ICO knew this last year, but they had not informed any of those affected. They still haven't, as far as I'm aware. And how did the public only hear about this after a year? With the GDPR, there is a responsibility to get this information out into the open. People, companies, for instance, are beholden to their clients who they're holding their data for. So one positive from the GDPR, particularly with regards to this, is that organizations won't be able to hide behind a headline wall of 3.2 million customers affected. This is actually your data, this is my data, and the data of 3.2 million other individuals who should be individually informed that their data has been breached. Another one after that, obviously, is Equifax. Now, the GDPR follows UK users as part of Europe. Now, they had over, I think it was 14 million UK records that were exposed, just UK ones. The EU probably can't go out after them under GDPR at this point, but there might be continued fallout for this, so watch this space. And the last one is Bupa. Now, an internal threat actually released data, and this does kind of show the need under GDPR for that internal awareness piece and that internal security piece. It shows a need to monitor not just external threats like the other two, but internal ones as well. I mean, Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think these are great examples of what we're going to see hit GDPR, and like you said, the first incidents are still barely starting to work their way through the process. One of the interesting things with Dixon's is that it was also a PCI breach. And if I remember right, some of the initial notification was actually news articles around it rather than necessarily Dixon's talking to ICO saying that we've had a breach. So not only did they not report it necessarily in a timely fashion, the first reporting of it was broadly public, which is something you definitely don't want under GDPR. So I think that's another good example where some of those the fines could have been incredible, as well as the PCI breach that they're having to deal with. Equifax is a great example. It's not an EU company, but is a substantial collector of data from EU citizens, which puts them potentially under GDPR compliance. And one of the challenges with Equifax would be how do you determine the authority to go after the revenue and whether that chain works all the way down. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about of who is the DPA, who is the supervisory authority, and what's the connectivity all the way back up to the GDPR regulation. And like you said on Bupa, it's just a great example that when you're thinking about how to protect your data, you're thinking outside attack, but you also have to think insider loss. And because that one person doing something that they know, that probably knew that they shouldn't have done, now put that company at a major risk of fairly substantial fines.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Rob. I will just move it on to the next slide here, and I'll quickly go over the three-way disconnect. Now, this is a theory that the GDPR involves actually three, among many, departments. That's the IT department, security department, and governance department. Now, in large organizations, these are always separated, and they don't always work together. So when GDPR comes into it, you actually have this three-way disconnect between people managing the IT side of it, people managing the data privacy by design, the security part of it, and also the actual audit and risk part of the GDPR, which makes up the biggest part of the reporting, which is governance. They don't always work together, and the point is that bringing in a DPO brings all of those together because there is one strategic role to which all of them must report with regards to GDPR. And that ensures that, say Article 32, which is security specific, can be fully audited to comply with Article 44, which is a governance issue, and so on. Anything, Rob?
Other than that, this again gets into that fuzziness, and this is why the 60% of answer from the first question is that if the governance side is trying to take care of things and maybe changing policies around marketing, but they haven't involved the security side to identify and control what data is there.
Absolutely.
That's why we hit that high number of what level of involvement is this disconnect.
Yeah. Well, Rob is actually going to show you our own GDPR program for illustrative purposes. I'll just pass it on to you, Rob.
Sure. So inside LogRhythm, our office of the CISO, James Carter, if you've ever seen him talk or presented anything, is officially the DPO, and we've tied this into our governance and regulatory compliance team. They have been working on it for really the last 2 years. First piece is assessments, doing broad DPIA and DIA for our own, or a PIA, DIA for our own internal store of customer data, making sure we have the legal basis for all of our data processing defined and clearly identified, and then figuring out what our obligations are under data subject rights compliance. And for us, this kind of has hit really kind of 3, maybe 4 major areas. The first area that everybody has to deal with is your own employees. We have a UK office, we have several international offices. The rights follow the citizen regardless of which office they're in. So that meant that we have to have a globally defined policy for data related to us as employees. Second area is obviously customers, and this falls under the legal basis that we're under contract. We have to have support contacts. We have to have billing contacts, making sure we know where all that is, what it is, what level of data is involved in it. Is it just a name and a phone number, or is there more detail? That was a big area to look at. The marketing area, most companies are going to have this as well, the business-to-business or business-to-consumer marketing. All of the data you might want to collect about potential leads or opportunities or customers, and how do you know what you've collected, how identifiable is it. Obviously, you want that information to be as identifiable as possible because those are people you're trying to get to buy your product. But at the same time, the more you collect, the bigger risk you have under GDPR. And then sort of the fourth area for us was honestly recruiting. Particularly for our European operations, of every time somebody sends us a resume, what right do we have to hold on to that data? Is that a consent? Is that legal obligation? We're not under contract with them, so we can't use the contract language. And how do we manage to control that? Because again, we want to keep a list of potential candidates, but every time we do that, we have to have a reason for having that data. We have to know how to contact that individual if there is a breach. It gets pretty complicated to take a look at. So those are the assessment areas we've been heavily involved in. Moving forward in terms of binding corporate rules, fortunately for us, we've had a lot of this in place for a long time, but we've gone through and re-updated or re-reviewed and re-audited our data protection policy, our data processing agreements, data handling policies, security practices. We've been running things, for example, like anti-phishing exercises inside of our company. So every now and then you get an email that just is so tempting to click on that link. I don't believe, Chris, you've fallen for any of those, have you?
No, I haven't.
That's so tempting. But we're doing internal training and internal policy. We've got some posters that we put up everywhere about password security as well as data privacy security. So it's awareness of the rules as well as implementation of the rules. And then marketing evaluation, we've talked about this a lot. And then the fourth area for us has been customer preparedness. Our customers who buy LogRhythm SIEM, how does the SIEM fit into their GDPR compliance? So as an example, we have been pulling together draft DPIA statements for uses of our systems. So as an example, the one that I have up on the board is for our UEBA solution right now. It's called Cloud AI. And we've written a data protection impact assessment report that describes what data we collect, what right we think we have to collect it, or what you would have to collect it, and what all the impacts are under GDPR. So you can literally take this data protection impact assessment, pass it on to your DPO, and just put it as part of your policy and your process. And that'll help shortcut the time it takes to get these things onboarded and through GDPR and changes to your system as you start taking better security posture. So that, hand it back to you, Laura, for our next results.
Thank you, Rob. All right then, so the voting has stopped, and we asked you how involved you are in your GDPR compliance plans for your company. Now, 40% of you said that you're not sure if you're involved, 10% you're answering auditor questions, and 50% of you are working on your security policies. So, Rob and Chris, do you want to kind of give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the 40% saying I'm not sure I'm involved doesn't surprise me that much. I mean, the thing is, we know that awareness training and GDPR awareness in general in the UK and outside of the UK is not necessarily at the level it should be yet. People are quite slow to uptake. But yeah, one thing I can say is that how involved are you in the GDPR compliance plans for your company? You're all involved in some way or another. So the idea is just obviously finding where you're involved in that. If you're an IT professional, you will definitely have to be part of that with regards to, say, Articles 32 through 40. And if you're in auditing, then you'll definitely be part of the governance bit, which is 40 onwards, plus some bits just before that. It covers everyone. And plus, you guys are also data subjects as employees. So there is a responsibility for the company to protect your data. You're part of it in whether you like it or not, really. Rob, do you have anything?
No, I think the other answer, the working on security policies, is what we expect as well. I mean, the number one way to make yourself GDPR compliant fundamentally really is just good data hygiene and good security practices. Breaches are going to happen, so you want to close off all the easy things. You want to pay attention to the way that breaches are occurring, both internal and external. You want to have your policy in place for how you communicate when a breach does occur. But setting up those security policies, educating people about those security policies, that's the number one thing that's going to take you from a reprimand into a Tier 1 or Tier 2 fine, is whether you've got those policies in place and you can show that they're in place and you can show that you're following them. So that's not a bad place to be either. As I have half the audience working on security policies. That is a critical part of GDPR.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Rob and Chris. Some good advice there. We're going to move on to one last vote to take us into the last section of the presentation. Voting has opened, and we're asking you if your cybersecurity team is ready for GDPR. So there are 5 options to choose from. And again, please vote whilst we are listening to the next segment. And if you have any questions, please do submit them. And if we have time at the end, we will ask those questions to Rob and Chris at the end of the presentation. Over to you, Rob.
All right, so for our last segment, we're going to talk about leveraging a SIEM for GDPR. And since we're LogRhythm, we're pretty much going to be talking about the LogRhythm SIEM, although some of this will apply generally to any SIEM product you have. But to start at the beginning, what a SIEM does is it collects, parses, and enriches logs, analyzes them for security events, and then we have two separate streams that really relate to GDPR. One is support of auditing. Who's accessing that information, who's accessing data, and how do I get those reports? And then the other side is that monitoring for breaches and potentially responding to those breaches. And that's where the SOAR or SAO, Security Orchestration Automation response, comes into play. A good SIEM should help you with all of these areas. And fundamentally, from a GDPR language perspective, that means that you have proof of your binding corporate rules, because you can say we monitor access to personally identifiable information that's stored on this particular system. We monitor by looking at the network traffic and the application traffic. Here's a report of everybody who's touched it. You can do the second and the third part if you've got that SIEM in place and you've got it set up right. The second area is like the compensating controls. When you don't have privacy by design, you don't have data security by design, sometimes you can use the SIEM and some of your other detection tools to wrap that area in a layer of monitoring that kind of helps give you coverage. And the SIEM is then going to elevate that up to let you know when something has happened there that you didn't expect to have happen. And then the last side, of course, that investigation and respond. The good SIEM is going to say, hey, something weird is going on here. We're seeing abnormal behavior from this particular user account, and they're accessing things that they shouldn't. A good SIEM will give you the ability to go shut down that account, or force a password change, or change, maybe change your two-factor authentication for that user, or other ways to stop the potential loss of data and control it, as well as to see exactly what happened along the way. So some of it is investigate to know what happened, but the other side is a good SIEM is going to help you respond and take action to slow down, stop, or remediate any breaches that do happen. So with LogRhythm, one of the things that we built on top of our SIEM is what we call our GDPR Compliance Module. And this is a module that you can do. It's free. It's part of our knowledge base. You can download it. You can turn it on. And what it's really designed for is tying together the best practices from our consolidated compliance framework in relation to the GDPR articles. So when you deploy this module, the first thing you really do, just like you do with GDPR, is identify all your target systems. What are the in-scope log sources that are going to either have PII or relate to PII that we need to monitor? What security systems are doing that monitoring? What production systems, what Windows servers, what Linux servers, databases we need to look at? And then what data storage systems, whether it's a database or a file system or some other location where PII might be stored. So that audit has to be in place. Then we look at the users. We can potentially whitelist or blacklist users. We can look at locations. Where should data be accessed from, or where should it not be accessed from? And then we get into this control mapping that you can kind of see on the right, is that for any article inside of GDPR, the GDPR module we have lists an entire set of rules and alarms that might fire, investigations you can run, or reports you can run that will help show that you're in compliance with that particular component. So it's pretty comprehensive, and even just downloading the guide and looking in the back to say Article 25, what does it mean and what should we do about it, gives a lot of value. So once you've got the module in place and you've got the alarms in place, we have some built dashboards that are specifically designed to focus on GDPR, give you visibility into your controls, immediate views of incidents or potential incidents, lets you launch investigations into breaches, lets you open our case management for breach analysis and reporting. But it's a dedicated dashboard that you could potentially have up on your screen or monitor for GDPR compliance. And it's taking advantage of, again, all of that audit as well as the rules that are in place around GDPR articles. Pretty comprehensive module. It's something we're continuing to work on and build, so it's getting updated on a fairly regular basis as well. But something that on top of a good SIEM that's collecting that data, you want something that's going to be focused on helping you ensure that your controls are in place, that you're monitoring your controls, that you can identify a breach, and that you can respond to that breach in a proper fashion. Chris, anything you'd like to add?
Well, no, it was just to basically add that this was the 90% that I was talking about, the continuous monitoring. Once you've done all of those audits and once you've got the basic amount of compliance, continued compliance and continued breach monitoring, continued reporting on this is exactly what you need. And so tools to make that easier for companies are the things that they should be looking for. And that's just in general, not just at LogRhythm.
So as you're thinking about GDPR, you're trying to shift from the I might be involved to I'm fully aware of and involved. Some great questions to ask, and Chris, feel free to jump on these as well. The first obvious one is, do you capture personal information of EU subjects at scale? Not accidentally one or two, but hundreds or tens of thousands, because that's going to put you into the realm of needing to look at GDPR compliance. Second, I think it's beholden on everybody inside the IT security compliance group to know who the DPO is. Because at the end of the day, that DPO is the one who's most likely to end up in front of the courts saying, we tried and failed, we didn't bother trying, or we tried and succeeded. So if you don't know who that DPO is, you have a greater liability and greater problem with your GDPR compliance. Audit, knowing where your sensitive data is, we've kind of hammered this one. Completing DPIA, having the data purposes defined, these are all critical steps. Plans for accessing, changing, extracting, and erasing sensitive data. This is perhaps one of the toughest parts of compliance with the 4 rights that we talked about. Privacy by design or data protection by design, Article 25. If not, what are your compensating controls? And then finally, really, what is your data breach response plan? It's going to happen sooner or later. Security is never 100%. There's always something new coming out there, some new way, or some user. Maybe the one user that you have to trust in the system might be the one that walks away with the data. So data breaches will occur, so you have to have a clear response plan, know who you're supposed to communicate with, know how you're supposed to communicate with them, and practice it.
Yeah. And just one thing to add to that is also, if you have these plans in place, implemented, or if you have a data breach response plan, have you tested those plans? Have they been stress tested? And also, I mean, are you mature enough on the process to be confident that you won't get, fined by the EU, even if something goes wrong? God forbid.
Yeah. Now back to Laura for the results of our last question.
Yes, thanks, guys. So the vote has stopped, and we asked you if your security team is ready for GDPR. 20% of you have said no. 10% are answering auditor questions by running reports. 40% of you are prepared. You've already prepared some plans and started some audits. 10% have some active monitoring of PII access, and 20% of you have a multi-tiered defence covering internal threats, external threats, and accidental exposure of PII. So, Chris, Rob, what do you think of that? Who wants to tackle that one first?
I'm really proud of the last group that has the multi-tiered defense, because at the end of the day, that's the ideal of what we want for any kind of security, much less just GDPR.
Yeah, I mean, something I'd be interested to find out is that the answer to the question, no. So is your cyber security team ready for GDPR, is whether that's based on what we've said today, and whether people thought they were ready before. There isn't. It sounds like there's a complex amount of things to do, but it isn't actually that complex if you're already beholden to some other type of compliance. The controls are more or less the same. It's something that you just have to work on with regards to risk and putting those controls in place in your organization.
All right, thank you very much. Right, well, the presentation's done, but we're going to take some questions. There are a couple there, and if you have any just now, please do submit them. And one of the questions I want to ask first is, the fact that someone's picked up on the fact that we've talked about GDPR relating to other compliances, and we said specifically around PII. So someone's asking, what other compliance standards do we support?
Sure, so we talked about that again, PCI. So if you have any kind of payment card industry, you're processing credit cards of any kind, has some great controls on it because it's already touching personally identifiable information. Another one that's more US-centric, but we've seen international variants or forced compliance with it, is what came out of the US for HIPAA, high-tech, and meaningful use. These are all healthcare related. So if you happen to have looked at the HIPAA framework or the HIPAA, meaningful use, high-tech, the 3 different compliance that all kind of tie together, that's a great framework for looking at and controlling personally identifiable data, not just simple data like username and phone number and maybe an address, but actual deep data like medical records. Other ones that come into play, even things as simple as like Sarbanes-Oxley, the ISO 27001 has a number of controls that are very relevant to what you need to do with GDPR. So almost any framework actually is going to give you a help, but the ones that definitely already tie to personally identifiable information are the better ones to look at as either a reference if you want to get started, or if you're already in compliance with those, you can probably cross-leverage almost everything you've done.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And I guess the last one for Chris as well is if you happen to be in compliance with the predecessor to GDPR, and I'm going to forget the number, so GDP 13?
Oh,
GPG 13, yeah.
Yeah. The public services network.
Right.
Compliance, yeah. Now, you will have followed most of the controls for that, but that mostly applies to local authorities and some NHS entities, at least within the UK. But then the ICO came out with some guidance a couple of years ago saying that people could decide their own levels of compliance, in which case some local authorities that didn't have GPG 13 before, that now have something similar, probably aren't quite at the level of GDPR, but that's something to look out for.
Right. And then if you've got nothing else to start with, you can also look at what used to be the SANS Top 20, but is now the CIS computer security controls. And it's just a good list of 20 standard security controls that are going to fit very nicely with GDPR. The Australian Signals Directorate Top 20 is very similar as well.
All right. Excellent, thank you. All right, so a question here as well is what should the notification to DPAs contain, and how do I find the right information? Rob, do you want to tackle that one?
Like Chris mentioned, the description of the notification is perhaps the most specific part of GDPR. You very definitely need to identify which data subjects might have been involved, what of their data might have been involved, when you first discovered potential and started investigating, what you know at the time that you're initially reporting, as well as when you're going to report on follow-ups. So it's actually very clearly spelled out at one level inside of the regulation. Getting the supporting data is, again, right why you need a SIEM and the ability to run the right kinds of investigations, the right kinds of case management and controls and reports to go back and look and pull out who was involved and when did the first evidence show up and when did we become aware of the first evidence. And what you're really trying to avoid is your IT or security guy who doesn't necessarily think they're involved in GDPR sending that email saying, hey, we might have a breach here. I think there's personally identifiable information. And then a month later, your data protection officer actually hearing about it, because that's what's going to accelerate those fines.
Yeah.
I mean, Articles 33 and 34 are not in the most incredibly obnoxious legalese, so they're actually quite easy to read, and they do give absolute specifics on what you need to include.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. All right. So how are we for time? Right, we're doing okay. I think we'll ask another couple of questions. Chris, I'd like to ask you this one. Does GDPR compliance differ based on the number of employees a company has?
Yes. Now, it's mostly guidance more than being strict to GDPR. I mean, it's expected that everyone, particularly in marketing practices, will follow some levels of GDPR and will determine whether there are different types of interest within their organization, and that goes from non-profits and little clubs like the local history club down the road all the way up to, you know, your huge organizations of 20,000 plus employees. But the onus is definitely higher on larger organizations because they will inevitably be processing more data. There are exceptions to the rules. You've got managed services and data processors, marketing teams where they only have perhaps 20 employees that they're processing the details of 50 million people. There will be a huge amount of controls needed for that, and it will be quite difficult for smaller organizations. They probably will be expected to bring in external help. But when it comes to smaller organizations underneath 250 employees who are processing data normally rather than being B2C organizations, so say just a normal service organization.
Yeah, so non-commercial, you don't have a storefront.
exactly, where you're not necessarily collecting consumer data en masse. You don't really need to appoint a DPO. You can have that as your IT head, someone who is responsible for IT and security and governance all in one role. Yeah, you will only need to follow the minimum controls, say ISO 27001 related, that kind of level.
All right, super. All right, now I'd like to ask the last question, and this is for me to help the audience out here, and that's if you had to summarize GDPR into 3 things, what would they be? Now, Rob, I'd like you to take a stab at that one, please.
So if I had to summarize it in 3 things, the first is audit. Know what data you're collecting, know why you're collecting it, know where it's collected. If you don't have that, you're going to fail nearly everything related to GDPR. The second is good controls around that data. So once you know what it is, how are you going to collect the data about it? That's, again, where a good SIEM is going to come into play, putting the right security layers around it, putting the right log sources around it, getting the right awareness and controls around it. And then third is fundamentally monitoring, and that's the key part. If a breach happens and you get pulled up on GDPR, you're going to have to show that not only did you know what the data was, that you had controls around it, but that you actively followed those controls. And if you can say yes to all 3 of those, the odds of you getting hit with a really big fine are much less than if you could say, well, we kind of knew what data we had, but we weren't aware that we had this other data that was what was actually exposed. That's going to get you into a lot of trouble. We had controls, but maybe not good enough. That might get you into trouble. As well as we had controls, but we don't really follow them. We only respond when the auditor calls us and tells us to run a report. That's not going to go over real well. So if I had to, again, summarize it in 3, audit, control around the data, and then awareness and continuous monitoring.
All right. Superb. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I think that's all we really have time for, looking at the time. If we haven't got to one of your questions, then we'll do our best to answer that question directly to you.
If you've opted in to give us your contact information, we are talking about GDPR after all.
Indeed, absolutely. Very good point, actually. Thank you, Rob. All right, so that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining today. I really hope you found it informative. We will be following up with a link to the on-demand version, which you can share with your colleagues if you see the need. We'd really appreciate you giving us a feedback and a rating for the webinar. And thank you very much indeed. I will let you back to your day. Thank you.